Hi, I'd like to welcome you to a wonderful afternoon uh, here in Middle Tennessee. I've spent about the last 5.5, 6 months working on a novel. My dad had collected notes over the years, and we've been formulating those into his first novel, and it's called Mary and Murray. Hopefully, we'll be out with that soon. Meanwhile, I've written a short story I'd like to read to you, maybe take you to a simpler time. Uh, with all the craziness going on today, there was a simpler time when people just loved each other. Uh, and I'd like to also welcome my camera person today is my father. 86 years old and still kicking like a mule. So for him, I'd like to read a short story I've written called The Red Bandana. No one in Coffee County, Georgia actually believed all of Old Man Johnson's numerous stories. Still, most people enjoyed hearing them. After all, he was a simple man with integrity, worth listening to. Since he was my elder, I referred to him as Mr. Johnson. The yarns he spun made people feel warm and fuzzy. They reminded each listener of a unique time or situation in their own life that they fondly remembered. And could he spin a tale? What usually started as feigned interest by the listener grew as he immersed them with vivid details and occasional commentary from days gone by. He always had his red bone hound, named Lucy, with him. She was more often than not lying at his feet sleeping, as if to say with love, "I've heard all this before." According to Mr. Johnson, Lucy had some stories of her own. They were good for each other. She loved him, and she was about all he had left in his life. He had buried his wife some 10 years ago after a long bout with cancer. I think a part of him left with her. Folks say they still often see him taking her favorite flowers to her grave, spinning yarns and talking to her as if she were still there to listen. It was of little consequence to him, though, because his tales, more often than not, had no perceivable audience anyway. He was well known throughout the county where he was born and raised. As a child, I remember his old blue Ford pickup, which, like him, had seen its better days. The local drivers often had to toot their horns to remind him to go when the light turned green, and pass him on the Pearson Highway as he ambled along at his own slow, deliberate pace. He always smiled and waved as we passed. It made it hard not to like him. He never missed church, but most other times he could be found sitting in some local store telling his tales to anyone who would listen. Sometimes his entire audience was comprised of Lucy. On this particular Saturday, as my dad and I walked into Martha Katie's store, his eyes lit up at the prospect of yet another opportunity to narrate some event in his life to a fresh audience. This was a slow day at the store, and he hadn't had many folks to talk to. Paul Katie, who owned the store, had kept Martha's name on the sign. His wife had wanted to operate a store and insisted it would keep him busy after she was gone. Paul treated Mr. Johnson with the utmost respect, like most all the local business owners. He was loved and welcomed by all. Paul sold sausage biscuits for breakfast. The local field hands would flock to the store early in the morning before going out to the surrounding fields to work. As a matter of fact, fields of corn stood on each side of his store. The morning biscuits were Mr. Katie's bread and butter, so to speak, when it came to keeping the store open. Each morning he made sure Mr. Johnson got his biscuit, pretending to put it on credit. After all, a man with dignity wants no handouts. Mr. Johnson had worked hard all his life, and his new occupation as storyteller was certainly no exception. He worked hard at it. Dad and I walked over to Mr. Johnson and talked to him for a while. I scratched old Lucy behind her ears. Her eyes didn't open, but her tail thumped. She was thinning, graying around her muzzle, and moved a whole lot less than she used to. Mr. Johnson and his wife had gotten her as a puppy. she brought him fond memories of his wife, of which he was not ready to forget. I didn't think he would ever be ready. Dad asked Mr. Johnson how he was doing. Respect for one's elders was a big thing in our area. Well, now, I'm doing fine, but you'll have to ask Lucy about her day. She's had quite a day, Mr. Johnson chuckled. He was going to use her to segue right into another tale. I looked at the old dog and knew she had just been asleep most of the day, but I didn't say so to Mr. Johnson. She looked up at the mention of her name and gazed at Mr. Johnson with immense love. She wagged her tail and went back to sleep. "Did I tell you about the time?" he began. Lucy was, by now, fast asleep, as he began a story she'd heard 1,000 times. He decided on the story about courting his wife and eventually marrying her. She was a pretty gal, yes sir, prettiest in the whole county. Now once I'd met her, I wasn't about to let her get away. She was a catch. Her family's farm, Mr. Johnson continued, was about 2 miles down that very dirt road, he offered, pointing to the washed-out dirt road running in front of the store. It was a good distance, and we didn't have no automobiles in them days. Our family had an old blind mule named Blue, and she was my transportation. She was our family car. After I'd get done in the fields of an evening, I'd head to Clara's house. Her family was very religious and didn't think it proper for us to be alone together, and they kept a close eye. So I had to help her wash dishes and such just to get to be with her. But I didn't mind. An old washpan and a bucket of well water was about all we needed. Love was in the air. Theirs was a poor family like ours, and she'd become very thrifty. She sewed, darned socks, and mended old boots using her leather awl. And boy, could she cook. Turnip greens and pork chops that would melt in your mouth. And the best cornbread I've eaten to this very day, he said as he glanced to see if I was listening. She made the absolute best food I ever put in my mouth, Mr. Johnson concluded emphatically. She did all that and then cleaned and tended the baby of the family so everyone else could go to the fields and work. Sun up to sundown were the normal hours in her workday, and she was still practically a kid herself, he emphasized. Sometimes after a heavy rain, the road was flooded out with bad washes, so we'd cut through the woods on our way to see Clara. He paused, and a smile accompanied the faraway look in his eyes. He was remembering Clara as a young woman. Mr. Johnson's eyes were beginning to moisten, so I intervened by asking how a blind mule could see to step over logs and such. He had sucked me into another tale. Why, son, she was a good mule to begin with, easy to train. So whenever I'd see a log on the trail, I'd say, "Step up," and she would, pretty as you please. And here he got that distant, faraway look again as he went on with the story. Old Blue seemed as determined to get there as I was. I think she knew I was falling in love before I did. Animals can sense those things, you know, son. Mr. Johnson continued. Clara and I were married and spent 74 wonderful years together before. And there he stopped a moment. I could feel a short commentary coming. Finally, he looked me straight in the eye and he said, "Look for something that lasts in this world, boy." He emphasized, like true and honest love. Beats money in the bank every time. Dad and I moved over to the drink machine for a Coca-Cola. Mr. Cady still had the machine with the glass door. You put your money in, open the little glass door, and pulled out your drink. And it was still in the small glass bottle. I miss those small glass bottles, and the Coke seemed to taste better than when drinking it from plastic, concluded Mr. Johnson. Dad walked to the store counter and bought us each a small bag of peanuts to pour in our Coca-Cola. Then he and I enjoyed a fine Southern tradition together. I looked over at Mr. Johnson sitting in a chair, trying his best not to nod off. Naps seemed to come often to him, whether he liked it or not. I thought back to something my grandmother always said. Once a man, twice a child. It was true. Mr. Johnson's needs and habits were indeed becoming more childlike for the second time in his long life. It comes back for us all if we live long enough, I reckon. I couldn't help but smile as I finished my cold drink, all the while watching Mr. Johnson try to fight sleep. It was not a new battle for him lately, so fight he did. He knew if he napped that he may miss the opportunity to spin another yarn before we left. Dad and Mr. Cady talked politics and religion for a while. Mr. Cady said business had been slow lately, but he expected things to pick up as the surrounding crops matured and the harvesters moved in. He had an air of expectancy, as he called it. He had a wonderful attitude and everlasting love for Martha. He said he would keep the old store open for as long as he was able to in Martha's memory. And he certainly didn't want her sitting around in heaven worrying about him having something to do. I really admired his tenacity and positive attitude. To this day, I make a conscious effort to maintain and demonstrate a positive attitude as a man because of these men's influence on me as a boy. Another life lesson from these men was, waste not, want not. These men had survived the Great Depression, often relying on government-sponsored work programs just to pay the mortgage on their farms and keep the taxes paid. So folks wasted nothing in those days, even small fish caught from a farm pond. I remember one of those times Dad and I took Grandpa and Mr. Johnson fishing. They'd been lifelong friends. They would often take me along when they fished, even though at the time I was very young and probably a nuisance. Now, all these years later, it was my turn to take them, and they were not nuisances to me. It was a beautiful day in South Georgia. As we shoved our John boat into the water, I was always, and am today, a little leery about all the low-hanging limbs of the abundant cypress trees in the pond. Cottonmouth moccasins love to hang on these limbs, and if bothered, strike. I've even had a few drop off into my boat. That's probably what originally necessitated me learning to swim. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, there were also gators in the pond. So, if you chose to swim to the bank, you swam fast. Well, on this particular expedition, I can remember both Grandpa and Mr. Johnson were whistling, not from their lips, but from their ears. Every time they leaned over to bait their hooks, their hearing aids would emit a piercing, high-pitched squeal. And they leaned over to bait their hooks a lot that day because we were using cricket, and the perch and brown were taking them off the hook seemingly at will. But despite the noises and extremely elusive fish, I relished the time spent with these men. I was learning to be a man myself, and these were fine examples. Soon we began to catch fish. They were small, but then bluegill always put up a good fight, so that didn't matter to these men. We had a 5-gallon bucket to put our fish in. We didn't know what size fish would be in the bucket when we left, but we knew it would be full. This was what Grandpa called the honey hole. That meant lots of fish nearly every time we went. Grandpa had a larger pond on the farm up next to the dirt road. He mostly used it to irrigate huge fields of corn, tobacco, and soybean. But being larger, he had stocked it with big blue cat, speckled perch, and largemouth bass. It was close to 30 acres in size, so you can imagine the size of some of those fish. The big ponds opened our entire community, as far as Grandpa was concerned. If you were hungry, you came and fished for your food. I also learned later that he was responsible for several gardens, all tended by him for our elderly neighbors. Grandpa and Mr. Johnson often prepared fallow fields in the spring for folks when they were sick. Being a good neighbor in those days often required effort, which they were more than willing to provide. I sure miss those simple days. Oh well, back to our story. We were fishing around an old cypress knee, sticking up out of the water. We were having good luck around it, but the fish were small. One by one, they dropped perch and brim into the bucket. They were numerous, albeit very small. Some of them were barely bigger than the starhead minnows we often use for bait, especially when crappie fishing. I just kept on fishing for the big one, thinking all the while that maybe their eyes were as bad as their ears. Surely all these men could feel how small these fish were. Finally, curiosity got the best of me. I asked Mr. Johnson why they were keeping all the small fish, and he just chuckled and said, "You'll see, boy." We finished our day of fishing, which had been wonderful, and headed home with a very big bucket of very small fish. We got home and I watched them clean the small panfish. Finally, they cut off the heads of each fish, battered it, dropped each one into a greased cast iron skillet and fried them until they were brittle enough to eat, bones and all. I didn't have any, but there were none left anyway when these hungry men were done eating. Now this day, as I sat at Mr. Katie's store counter, I could see Lucy seemingly restless out of the corner of my eye. Mr. Johnson was busy cutting Z's again, snoring loudly. I walked over to Lucy and squatted beside her. She looked up at me and thumped her tail in acknowledgement. I asked her what she wanted as if she could answer. But answer she did. She slowly got up and went to the door, obviously asking to go out. I took her out to do her business after letting her sniff around briefly for just the right spot. She then went back to the door to be with her beloved master. They each now represented the only thing the other had, and they had a bond that can only be forged through love. That much was very obvious. Mr. Johnson woke up as the bell on Mr. Katie's front door rang when Lucy and I came back in. Dad handed Mr. Johnson an RC and a moon pie and asked how he was feeling after his nap. I think I actually feel a little better each time I'm blessed enough to wake up, he laughed heartily in reply. You know, I've come to realize after careful consideration just how blessed we are to wake up each day. He took a long breath with a blissful look on his face, as if breathing in all of the beauty of life itself. Son, did I tell you about the time my grandpa and his old dog Jake killed that there boar hog? Mr. Johnson asked. I told him that I'd heard it, hoping it wouldn't hurt his feelings. Me being honest. To this day in these parts, we respect our elders, no matter their gender, color, or station in life. It also meant respecting them after their usefulness had ended and redundancy had begun. I knew he had plenty of stories, but I had a particular one in mind. I'd only heard it once or twice. I asked Mr. Johnson to tell me about the red bandana. I offered this gesture as compensation for depriving him of his previous attempts. He immediately lit up and seemed to shed years along the way as his tale began to gain steam. You might have heard one of his tales before, but he always managed to recall new details each time he told them, embellishing them a little more each time, superfluously at times. Well, in those days, Mr. Johnson continued, horses and mules were our main transportation, and if you happened to have one you couldn't ride, well, you just had to walk a ways or stay home. Only two choices left to you, he said as he leaned forward to further animate his story. I was just a young'un, a good bit younger than you, and I had a horse named Queenie. I thought she was the prettiest little strawberry mare I'd ever seen. Strawberry roan. There was one problem, though. She was ornery and she was stubborn. The Lord have mercy, she was stubborn. He emphasized his conclusion. Every time I tried to ride her, she seemed to do whatever she wanted in spite of my best effort. Sometimes that involved running next to the fence row, and if it happened to be barbed wire, that could be real trouble. And dangerous, he concluded. I've got the scars on my knees to prove it. Other times, she took me under the clothesline in the yard, running full speed and all out. I'd feel her bunch up to run, look at Grandma's freshly washed clothes hanging on the line, and she'd dig out. Well, sir, I'd hunker down, lay flat, and hang on like a bronc rider. More often than not, despite my best efforts, I'd come out the other side with a bed sheet wrapped around my neck. It made me look like a superhero on horseback. But I knew, with that particular horse, I was no hero. Sometimes while riding for hours peacefully down the dirt road, she'd just lie down and roll. Other times I'd go to catch her around the pond and she'd wade out neck deep in the water and look at me as if daring me to come get her. And I would. Finally, my two brothers and I decided a group effort was needed. So we commenced the riding around the edges of Grandpa's tobacco field. One at a time, she deposited us like money in the bank, straight to the ground. She was trouble and she knew it. I began to worry at this point. If this was my transportation, I may never leave home. Here Mr. Johnson paused for a swig of Coca-Cola before continuing his story. However, he said, her sour attitude was changed forever by Grandpa in just one day. He was plowing the next field over with old Blue one chilly spring morning. It was time to turn the fallow ground for next year's crop. Like I said, I was in the next field over so he could see me. I was having my usual difficulties with Queenie. I guess he was glancing my way as he turned the plow each time back in the other direction. I could feel his glance, but I wanted to handle this myself. In those days you tried hard to become a man on your own, not like today. I can tell a difference today, but maybe it's just me," he said with sadness in his eyes. Well, about that time I could hear Grandma coming down the dirt road, and that meant it was now mid-morning. She was bringing a bucket of water and some kind of snack. Here he paused again for a drink before continuing. He had that familiar, faraway look in his eyes once again as he continued. "I can remember the old dipper we all used to drink with from that bucket. We all shared it, but it didn't matter 'cause we was thirsty. Back in those days we didn't complain a lot anyway. Now it seems ain't nobody happy no more. What happened to happiness? Did we use it all up?" He chuckled as if only to himself. Now where was I? Oh yeah, Grandma on the dirt road." And here he looked wistfully out the window at the dirt road again. "That particular dirt road right there, you go south long enough, it'll take you clear to the Atkinson County line. Oh well, back to the story. I could hear that wagon bringing Grandma with her cool water and something good to snack on. The ruddy dirt road took its toll on man, beasts, and equipment. I could hear that old wagon rattle and squeak a mile off. And about that time Belle, Grandma's mule, blew her nose to clear her nostril. All these sounds contributed to my thirst and hunger. My body was trained to the sound." She pulled the wagon into the nearest shade at the edge of the field under an old oak tree, stepped down from the wagon. That old wagon wasn't much to look at, but Grandpa had done what he could to make it as comfortable as possible for her. Blue's sister Belle was pulling the wagon, like I said. That mule always stood patiently for Grandma. Grandpa had seen to that. He followed one main rule when training animals. He was fair to them, and they in turn listened to him. I tied Queenie's reins to a sapling as Grandpa laid over his plow, and we all sat in the shade. It was getting hot up in the day now, even though it was just spring. Sometimes it was hard to tell the seasons because those long-leaf yellow pines stay green all year round. Gotta look at scrub oak and such for that. As we sat together, I could tell Grandpa had something to say, and I knew he would say it when the time was right. So we continued enjoying the snack in silence for a while. Grandma looked over at Queenie and was the first to break the silence. In those days, that was an adult's job. Children mostly spoke when spoken to. Seemingly out of the blue, Grandma asked how it was coming along with my horse. Grandpa's response was not from out of the blue, however. It had come from observing my numerous difficulties with Queenie for the large part of the morning. Grandpa told her I needed a little help with that. No animosity or sarcasm was needed in his statement because it was the gospel truth and I knew it. He was once again demonstrating his training rule. He was indeed treating me fairly, and I was indeed going to listen to him. No doubt about it. It wasn't a choice. Choices were offered only up to a certain point in those days, and I knew I had passed that point. So I prepared to listen. Grandma was exempt from this preparation and walked over to look at Grandpa's progress plowing in the field. Grandpa wasn't thinking of plowing the field. He knew, with me, he had a tough row to hoe, as they say, Mr. Johnson concluded. He had done taught me the difference between hearing and really listening, Mr. Johnson went on. Some people hardly bother to listen because that takes effort. I could hear old Blue Nicker as Grandma approached the plow. Although I could hear it, my attention was on Grandpa. When Grandpa talked, listening belonged to him, unless it was Grandma. I knew, always knew, who really ran the show. Then Grandpa began as he gazed into some distant place I may never see. He said he'd narrowed it down to one problem, watching me flounder around with that horse. He continued patiently as he told me that Queenie is confused as to who the boss is. Then he turned, looked me straight in the eye, and he asked, when it comes to you and me, just sitting here together right now, you know who the boss is, don't you? I didn't have to hesitate, as I said I did. I honestly acknowledged this to him and to myself as well. He told me that when no one's in charge, nothing gets done. Now, in your case, he continued thoughtfully, you have accomplished something. Then he looked at me to see if I understood what he said. There was hope in his eyes for me, and that look quickly turned to just plain old compassion as I responded that I didn't understand. He was patient. Thank God he was patient. He knew I was really listening, so that was enough for him. He looked back into that distant place and thought for a minute. Told me that every time I ride the horse, I'm teaching her something, for good or bad. Now, in my particular case, he said, I taught Queenie. She doesn't have to listen to me. He stood up as he said, now I'll have to teach her differently and as fair a way as she'll allow. As Grandpa approached Queenie, I could tell she knew something was up. At this point, Mr. Johnson started nodding off again, so I took Lucy outside. She didn't go far from the door, finally lying down in the shade of Paul Katie's store. She was getting old, I guess, like Mr. Johnson. The cicadas were out this year, so I just sat and listened to their cacophony for a while. I swear, you had a bluebird and throw in a crow or two, and brother, you got a beautiful song. I loved listening to Mr. Johnson's stories too, but a story can only last so long, like Mr. Johnson himself. I woke Lucy and we went back into the store, and Mr. Johnson was awake, enjoying his Coca-Cola and gaining steam again. His energy kind of came and went for him. He turned to me and chuckled. I was waiting for you and Lucy so I could finish my story. His eyes still had a sleepy look from his nap, but I guess he wanted us to pretend he hadn't dozed off, and we did. As Lucy made herself comfortable at his feet, he continued his story, and I got ready to listen. Mr. Johnson began again. As I said, I think Queenie knew something was up. As Grandpa approached her and took the reins from the sapling, I could see she was antsy as she sidled away from my grandpa when he attempted to put his dusty old boot in the stirrup. He patiently stepped down, circled her around him using the reins, and placed his boot in the stirrup again. Just as he gained his seat, Queenie took off at a full speed. Grandpa was not surprised by this. He had watched as I tried to work with her for the good part of the morning as he plowed, so he expected it. Then she set her sights on the tobacco barn that was standing in the middle of an otherwise open field. Mr. Johnson continued. Now, I was a little worried, but Grandpa wasn't. This wasn't his first rodeo, as they say. Grandma wasn't overly concerned either, but also turned to watch. Grandpa was both brave and determined, and Grandpa liked watching him show it. Grandma liked watching him show it. She always admired his confidence and hoped I'd be gaining some of my own. Mr. Johnson sat back in his chair and continued, well, sir, instead of trying to stop her, Grandpa demanded all the speed she had, and this was just fine with her for a while. Grandpa managed to redirect Queenie away from the barn by running her first in large circles and then reducing them. Queenie was giving it all she had, and Grandpa was still on her back and in control. He now had her back out in the open field where he wanted her. He made her run every which way until she showed signs of wanting to renegotiate their agreement. She was dropping her head and chomping her mouth as if to say, let's talk. Mr. Johnson chuckled loudly. But a parlay wasn't in Grandpa's plans. No, sir, not one bit. He reiterated with a sparkle in his eyes. Mr. Johnson continued as he leaned forward. As a matter of fact, it was her first clue as to who the boss really was. This time, he was in charge of their pace and direction. She was beginning to foam up on her chest from all this running. Just as Grandpa became satisfied, she was listening to him. Grandpa began letting her slow, as she had indeed begun to cooperate. Well, once again, Mr. Johnson got that glazed over look on that particular day as it came vividly back to life for him. He sat for a long period of time, just staring off in the distance. It was as if he was living vicariously now through his memories. Mr. Johnson slowly came back to the present, continued his story once again. Grandpa's golden rule of training animals come into play again. She began to listen, and he began to ease off the pressure on the reins. She understood. Mr. Johnson concluded as he reached down to pet Lucy. She responded by rolling on her back, giving him the opportunity to scratch her belly. Her back leg twitched as he scratched her ticklish spot. After all these years together, he knew right where it was. After what seemed like an eternity, Mr. Johnson forged ahead again. Well, Grandma was standing beside me, beaming proudly as Grandpa turned Queenie toward us, first at a canter and then a trot. Mr. Johnson recollected. Grandma slowly turned to me and said, He's a good man, honey. You can learn a lot from him. She stood with me, her arm around my shoulder. Grandpa approached us, sitting tall in the saddle. Come think of it, seems every time he was around her, and she smiled at him, he walked a little taller, or in this case, sat a little taller in the saddle. "Well," Mr. Johnson continued, "everything seemed fine and dandy to everyone but Queenie." Here he laughed loudly, even if only to himself. "It seemed Queenie wasn't done learning yet," he philosophized quietly. Grandpa approached us and decided to stop her, but she seemed to have other plans. "Maybe she wanted another go at it," Mr. Johnson offered. At any rate, my grandpa gently pulled back on the reins and quietly said, "Whoa." She had plans of her own. Grandpa tried using a firmer voice and tighter reins, but was met with more resistance. This was not acceptable to Grandpa. He'd been fair, and she still wasn't listening. Grandpa had already checked all of her tack, including bridle and bit, before making his plan. At this point, he decided it was a behavior choice, and I could see he had a solution to the problem. He calmly explained his course of action to me as Grandma nodded her approval with a smile. She'd spent much of her life with this man, and every time there was a need, he stepped forward. She knew that when he stepped forward, it was usually in the right direction. Grandpa always carried a red bandana in the right back pocket of his Oshkosh Begosh overall for wiping his hands and the sweat from his brow. He mounted Queenie and led her to that barn she was so fond of. He took out his bandana as he walked. He pointed her toward a nice, smooth wall in the barn and fashioned that bandana around her head so she couldn't see. He remounted her and they both stood motionless for a time. He went on. Grandpa started moving her back and forth, repeatedly saying, "Whoa." She wasn't having it. As a matter of fact, I think her brief rest had given her renewed energy. She wanted to run again. Here Mr. Johnson called for a swig of Coca-Cola before continuing. This was the climax of the story, and he had to tell it right. With renewed vigor, he went on. All at once, and to Queenie's surprise, Grandpa was in an accommodating mood. He dug his heels into her flanks, flapped the reins, and demanded that she run. There was only about 10 or so yards between Queenie and the barn. He could control the speed as she learned a valuable lesson, thus preventing her from injury. She would, however, soon experience a little self-inflicted discomfort. Grandpa was as gentle as an animal would allow, but a horse that won't stop is a danger to itself and others. This was a lesson Queenie must learn. There was no choice in the matter. She'd crossed the line with Grandpa. Well, now, just before Queenie's head made contact with that empty tobacco barn wall, Grandpa ever so softly said, "Whoa." It wasn't a tremendous blow, but it staggered her for a moment and got her absolute attention. She learned right then and there in the fairest way possible to stop when told. Grandpa took the bandana off Queenie's head and trotted her back towards us. This time, when he rode up to us, he said, "Whoa," in the quietest voice possible. She stopped immediately. She stopped so completely I thought she may never move again. He dismounted and handed the reins back to me. "The horse is all yours. Be the boss, son, or she will," Grandpa stated matter-of-factly. He kissed Grandma and headed back towards Old Blue and his plow. I could see Queenie suspiciously watching that red bandana hanging from Grandpa's back pocket as he walked away. "Told you so," my grandmother said as she mounted the wagon to go back to the house and start supper. "Come on, Belle. Let's go home," she offered softly to the mule as she turned the wagon for home. Here Mr. Johnson stopped. I had genuinely enjoyed his recent narrative, but I could see it had taken a lot out of him. Maybe one day more energy than he has, I worried to myself. His stories often require lots of animation and emotional energy from him. He began to nod off again, so Dad and I walked over to the store counter, leaving Mr. Johnson and his beloved Lucy to their nap. As time went by, Mr. Cady suggested we check on old Mr. Johnson, as his naps were frequent but usually fairly short. Mr. Cady grabbed a moon pie as an offering, walked around to Mr. Johnson. Maybe his sugar was low. My father and I were talking when Mr. Cady returned slowly with the unopened moon pie. He just looked at us. I could see that his eyes were glistening as he dropped his head. In his hand, I could see the moon pie and a small bundle of brown-eyed Susans that Mr. Johnson had intended for his beloved wife's grave that day on his daily visit. In those parts, you hardly saw one grown man hug another, but Mr. Cady and my dad did that day, for a long while too. I think they knew that along with Mr. Johnson, they had lost some sort of connection with their own past, and were confronted with their own mortality all at once. It seemed so surreal to me as they came for Mr. Johnson that day. I guess I thought that he told never-ending stories due to my youthful naivety. Since then, I've learned that none of us do. I finally began regaining my faculties and went over to hug on Lucy. She was watching as they prepared the gurney to take Mr. Johnson from us. She was definitely awake now, and confused. I could see that she knew. Animals sense that sort of thing, you know. Mr. Johnson had told me that himself. I comforted Lucy as best I could through my tears, and for the first time in my life I was not ashamed to cry. I figured if grown men could hug one another, then I could cry, and that I would be strong for Lucy and take care of her till she went to join Mr. Johnson. The three of us were watching as they rolled his lifeless body over onto the gurney, and I saw something fall from the right back pocket of his overalls to the floor. We all saw it. Mr. Cady, my dad, and I all stood, seemingly unable to speak, motionless. We must have looked a sight, as one of the ambulance crew, obviously new to the area, someone who'd never met Mr. Johnson, walked over and picked it up. He came over to us and offered it to the first one of us able to take it. "Who wants this?" he asked. "It's just an old red bandana." Lucy lived another year and then went to be with Mr. Johnson. Even to this day, when I see an old blue Ford pickup sitting at a red light, I look closely at that old man or woman, and I think of the stories they could tell if only there was someone to listen. And I learned there is a difference between just hearing and really listening. Finally, I wonder as I sit before my own children now, will they really listen to me as I tell them my stories? I give them each a bag of peanuts to put in their Coca-Cola as I begin, "Boys, have I told you the one about the red bandana?" And I really hope you enjoyed the story. Thank you. And Dad, that's a wrap on my cameraman, red button. Dad is looking for the button.